In the first light of dawn, the desert was breathing. A line of trucks moved slowly across the pale sand near Carlsbad, New Mexico, each one sealed, guarded, and labeled with nothing more than a number. The soldiers who drove them had no idea what was inside. The air was still, cold, and heavy with the smell of gasoline and dust. In the back of the lead truck, something moved, hundreds of small, restless bodies packed in darkness, twitching wings brushing against steel walls. Inside those steel boxes, America's strangest weapon was waking up. The sound was like rain or paper fluttering in the wind. They were bats, thousands of them. Each fitted with a tiny incendiary bomb no larger than a cigarette. Each one alive. Each one, in theory, a carrier of fire. It sounds like fiction, but it isn't. The plan had a name, Project X-Ray. Conceived in secrecy, funded by desperation, and buried by history. A weapon so bizarre that even the generals who approved it barely believed it could work. Yet for a brief, surreal moment in World War II, the United States seriously planned to burn Japanese cities to the ground, not with atomic fire but with wings. The story begins not in a military lab or a government office, but in the sky, above the blacked-out cities of Japan in 1942. Below, wooden houses clustered like tinder. By day they bustled with life and industry. By night, they were fragile silhouettes waiting for the next raid. The war in the Pacific had become a war of attrition, fought across oceans and islands, fought with machines and minds pushed to their limits. Every idea, no matter how outlandish, was suddenly worth considering. And in a war that seemed endless, madness often looked a lot like genius. On a cold night in December 1941, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, a small aircraft crossed over the Caribbean. Inside sat a man who could hardly be called a soldier. His name was Lytle S. Adams, a Pennsylvania dentist. He wasn't part of the military. He wasn't a scientist. But he was, in the peculiar American fashion, a dreamer. The kind of man who believed that if something sounded insane enough, it might just work. On that flight home, he stared out the window at the dark landscape below, watching the shapes of caves cut into the red rock of New Mexico. Then it hit him, like an idea dropped from the heavens. Bats. Millions of them lived in those caves. Tiny, silent, nocturnal creatures that could carry more than their own weight in flight. He thought about how they could slip into any crack, roost under any eave, crawl into the beams of wooden houses, exactly the kind that filled every Japanese city. And if each bat carried a small bomb, the rest, he thought, would take care of itself. When Adams landed, he didn't sleep. He typed. Through the night, he pounded out a 30-page proposal addressed directly to the White House, to the president himself. Its tone was feverish, poetic, and strangely patriotic. Think of thousands of fires, he wrote, breaking out simultaneously over a circle of 40 miles in diameter for every bomb dropped. Japan could be devastated, yet with minimal loss of life. The concept wasn't mass destruction, it was precision chaos. The idea of turning nature itself into a weapon. Adams believed the bat, humble and blind, could succeed where bombs and bullets failed. And in early 1942, that letter reached the desk of Franklin D. Roosevelt. The president, amused and intrigued, scribbled a note to his science advisor. "This man is not a nut. It sounds perfectly logical." With that single sentence, Project X-Ray was born. Within weeks, Adams found himself standing in the corridors of Washington, ushered into the offices of men who wore stars on their collars and suspicion in their eyes. They'd seen plenty of wild ideas, flying tanks, pigeon-guided missiles, death rays, but never anything quite like this. Still, Roosevelt's curiosity carried weight. And when the commander-in-chief says, "Investigate," you investigate. The military assigned the project to the National Defense Research Committee, the same secretive body overseeing everything from radar to the Manhattan Project. A small team was formed. Biologists, chemists, ordnance experts, and Adams himself, the dentist who dreamed of burning Japan with bats. They began their work under a veil of classification so thick that most of the people involved didn't even know what they were working on. To outsiders, it was simply another special weapons test. By spring 1943, the project had moved to Carlsbad Army Airfield, near the mouth of vast bat caves that stretched for miles underground. At night, the researchers would stand at the cave entrance, watching in awe as millions of Mexican free-tailed bats poured out in waves, swirling into the sky like smoke. Each one weighed less than an ounce. Each could carry a small payload without losing its flight. They seemed perfect, cheap, plentiful, and, perhaps most importantly, expendable. Scientists designed miniature incendiary devices, each just over an inch long, weighing about 17 grams, armed with a delayed fuse. They could burn at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to ignite wood, paper, or fabric in seconds. The bombs were ingenious in their own right, small, safe, and simple. But the real challenge wasn't the bomb. It was the bat. How do you control a creature that doesn't understand war? How do you tell it where to fly, where to sleep, where to die? The team devised a plan that bordered on science fiction. They would cool the bats until they entered hibernation, attach the tiny bombs with surgical clips, then load them into special casings shaped like bombshells. Each casing would hold over 1,000 bats in suspended sleep. When dropped from altitude, the casings would open automatically, releasing the bats as they warmed up and woke. In theory, they'd scatter, seek shelter in buildings across the target city, and, minutes later, ignite thousands of fires. It was elegant. Terrifyingly so. Nature as a precision incendiary device. Adams was convinced he was on the verge of something monumental. He spoke of saving lives, of ending the war faster, of avoiding the apocalyptic destruction that conventional bombing brought. He believed his bats could cripple Japan's war industry without mass civilian casualties. It was, to him, a humane weapon, one that burned buildings, not people. But theory is merciful. Reality rarely is. The first field test began before dawn, deep in the desert, under the watch of military police and curious scientists. The air was dry cold. Boxes of sleeping bats were loaded into a mock bomb casing, fitted to a small aircraft. The countdown began. Then, with a soft thud, the casing was dropped over the sandy test range. The mechanism opened. 1,000 dark shapes spilled into the sky, fluttering, rising, vanishing into the distance. For a moment it worked. Then, the fire started. Not on the targets, but on the base itself. Several bats, disoriented by the sudden release, had flown into nearby hangars and barracks before their time fuses went off. Minutes later, small tongues of flame licked up the walls. Within half an hour, an entire hangar burned to the ground. The test range was chaos. Fire crews scrambled, alarms blared, and Adams, watching from a distance, stood in stunned silence. The weapon had worked, just not where anyone wanted it to. Still, to the military brass, it was proof of concept. If bats could burn a U.S. base by accident, they could certainly burn a Japanese city on purpose. Funding increased. The project was moved to a more secure facility near Brigham, Utah, then later to a naval air station in California. Engineers refined the bomb casings, biologists tested hibernation times, and ordnance specialists calibrated the fuses to the second. What had started as one man's strange idea was now a $1 million operation under strict classification. And as the months went by, the war only grew darker. Japan's resistance stiffened. American casualties mounted. And somewhere, in a desert laboratory, thousands of bats hung in rows of steel cages, waiting for orders they could never understand. It was the age of impossible weapons. Flamethrowers, napalm, atomic theories scribbled on chalkboards. But in the quiet corridors of the X-ray project, something more unsettling was taking shape. The realization that even the most absurd idea could find life in war, if only someone believed in it enough. If you're fascinated by how far desperation can drive human invention, how close this bizarre plan came to rewriting the war's history, stay with us. What you're about to hear next is stranger, darker, and far more real than you could ever imagine. And if you want more forgotten stories like this, subscribe. It helps us keep history's secrets alive. The war machine was no longer bound by reason. Across the Pacific, B-29s were torching cities with incendiary clusters, reducing entire districts to ash in a single night. But somewhere between the chaos of strategy meetings and the cold calculus of production lines, Project X-ray continued to slither quietly forward, hidden behind layers of classification. Its code name didn't appear on any public record, its facilities marked only by numbers. To those who knew, it was the Bat Bomb. To everyone else, it didn't exist. By the summer of 1943, the Navy had taken over operations. The Army had been skeptical. The generals preferred conventional power, things that could be measured in tons of TNT. The Navy, however, saw something different. A tactical weapon for sabotage, a means to cripple Japan's supply lines without risking a fleet. Rear Admiral Ernest J. King approved the transfer. Under the Navy's watch, the project was assigned to the Marine Corps for testing and redesign. A new base of operations was established at the Marine Corps Air Station in El Centro, California, a stretch of barren desert that could swallow secrets whole. Under heavy guard, refrigerated trucks carried the test subjects across the country. The road was long and the bats were delicate. Technicians worked in shifts to ensure the animals stayed in hibernation, carefully monitoring temperature, humidity, and light. Every mistake meant hundreds of tiny corpses. The project consumed tens of thousands of bats in those months. Some died in transit, others during experiments. They were dissected, studied, replaced. To the scientists, they were not animals anymore, they were variables. A young biologist named Jack Kuffer later recalled how eerie the work became. "You'd hold a bat in your hand," he said, "and feel the faint pulse beneath its wings, knowing it carried a bomb. It was alive, but it wasn't free. None of us were." The research team slept in barracks beside the test field, their nights filled with the restless sound of fluttering wings echoing from hangars. Every dawn, they'd roll out cages by the hundreds, load them into steel containers and ready the next drop. The bombs themselves had evolved. Engineers from the Louis Fieser Group, the same chemist who invented napalm, developed a new type of incendiary capsule, using a gel that burned hotter and longer than anything before. Each bat was fitted with a small, white phosphorus charge and a delicate time fuse clipped to its chest. The device weighed only as much as a paper clip. When the bat awoke, it would crawl into a dark crevice as instinct dictated. Then minutes later, the charge would ignite, setting its refuge and everything around it on fire. It was beautiful in its efficiency, horrifying in its execution. Testing was relentless. Over 100 prototypes were built and dropped over mock Japanese villages constructed in the desert. The buildings were replicas down to the last detail: wooden frames, paper walls, tatami mats, lacquered eaves. They even imported traditional Japanese roofing materials to simulate real conditions. Observers watched from fortified bunkers as planes released the bat bombs from 5,000 feet. Each time, the casings opened with a soft mechanical hiss. Bats spilled into the dawn like smoke, some soaring gracefully, others falling limp to the sand. Minutes later, one by one, fires began to bloom. A roof here. A wall there. The test range lit up like a village under siege. The results stunned the observers. The fire crews couldn't keep up. Even with only a fraction of the bats surviving each drop, the number of ignition points far exceeded that of conventional incendiaries. Theoretically, a single bomber carrying hundreds of thousands of bats could ignite over 1 million separate fires. The math was simple and staggering. The Navy was convinced. They prepared for scaling up, tens of thousands of bombs, millions of bats, training crews for mass deployment over Japanese cities like Osaka, Yokohama, and Tokyo. Project X-ray was poised to move from theory to weaponization. And yet, behind the optimism, there was unease. The cost was spiraling. The logistics were nightmarish. How do you refrigerate millions of bats? How do you drop them without killing them? How do you keep them from escaping before the mission? Every step revealed new absurdities. Yet the war was a furnace that devoured logic. If it promised results, it would be pursued. Lytle Adams traveled between bases like a ghost of his own invention. He was no longer the eccentric dentist with a dream. He was a man caught between triumph and ridicule. The Navy's top brass respected his idea but mistrusted his methods. They called him Dr. Bat, sometimes to his face. Still he pressed on. In his mind, each technical setback was just another problem to solve. He believed this weapon could shorten the war, maybe even prevent the need for the bloodbath of an invasion. He spoke of it as the humane alternative: fire without radiation, destruction without annihilation. He saw himself not as a destroyer but as a saver of lives. And yet, every night, as he walked through rows of cages filled with trembling bats, even he must have felt the weight of what he'd unleashed. They were alive and they were doomed. Each one a living fuse, a tiny martyr to the madness of men. By late 1943, the project had reached its technical peak. The Navy prepared for a large-scale trial at the WWII Proving Ground in Utah, a sprawling test site surrounded by salt flats and secrecy. The base already hosted experiments with chemical and biological weapons. Now it would host a new kind of nightmare. In early December, the first full-scale release took place. Crews worked through the night, loading thousands of bats into refrigerated casings. The operation was conducted under heavy security, Even most of the pilots didn't know what they were carrying. At sunrise, the bombers ascended. The release was picture perfect. As the desert warmed, the bats woke, scattered, and sought shelter among the mock villages below. Observers watched through binoculars. The fires came slower this time, too slow. Many of the bats had died from cold or shock before they could ignite. But those that survived performed exactly as intended. The test buildings went up in flames one by one. A Marine major at the site wrote in his report, "This weapon outperforms all standard incendiaries by a factor of 10. The project seemed unstoppable. But bureaucracy is its own kind of enemy. Every success demanded more data, more refinements, more delays. Months turned into years. Each branch of the military wanted its share of credit, or control. The Army had dismissed it, the Navy had adopted it, but now the Air Force wanted oversight. The result was paralysis. By mid-1944, the world was changing faster than X-ray could keep up. On a July morning, Adams was summoned to Washington. He arrived at the Pentagon, exhausted, briefcase in hand, ready to present his final results to the Committee on Incendiary Warfare. He expected praise, perhaps even production orders. Instead, he was told to wait. Hours passed. When the meeting began, a colonel leaned across the table and said quietly, "Doctor, we're shutting it down." Adams blinked. Shutting it down? Why? The colonel looked at him with something between pity and amusement. Because, Dr. Adams, the Manhattan Project is about to deliver a bomb that can do in 1 second what yours can't do in 1,000 years. And just like that, Project X-ray was finished. The labs were closed. The caves were emptied. The documents were sealed. Bats were released into the night or quietly destroyed. Adams was dismissed without ceremony, his dream reduced to a footnote in the archives of war. But the strangest part was this. When the final analysis came in, the Navy concluded that the bat bomb could have been operational by mid-1945, just months before Hiroshima. If history had taken a slightly different turn, if the atomic program had faltered, Japan might have burned not from uranium but from wings. Even now, the surviving reports read like something out of a surreal novel. Part science, part horror, part tragic comedy. Nature harnessed as a delivery system for death. The line between ingenuity and insanity had never been thinner. And somewhere in the desert, long after the fires burned out, you could still hear the faint echo of wings. The wind carried it across the dunes, a reminder that even in the most rational of wars, madness always finds a way to fly. The desert winds died down after the project ended, but in the quiet that followed, something heavier lingered: silence. It was the kind of silence that only follows when an idea dies not by failure, but by being outshone. Project X-ray had not been defeated in the laboratory or on the battlefield. It had been erased by something far greater. The bat bomb was never built again, but its ashes were still warm when another kind of fire began to rise. Lytle Adams returned to civilian life with the faint look of a man who had glimpsed the edge of genius and fallen just short. He tried to speak about his work, but few believed him. A dentist claiming to have weaponized bats sounded like the delusion of a crank. The truth was buried in Navy vaults, stamped classified until decades later. But deep down, Adams knew it had been real. He had watched them burn. He had seen his weapon work. He just hadn't seen it unleashed. And maybe that was mercy. In the months that followed, the scientific community turned its eyes elsewhere. The desert that once echoed with the sound of wings now trembled with the hum of reactors. At Los Alamos, men in white coats were drawing up blueprints for a sun made by human hands. The atomic age was beginning. Compared to that, bats were quaint, an echo of an older madness, almost comical in its simplicity. But every revolution has its roots, and the line from a dentist's imagination to the splitting of the atom was straighter than most realized. Both were born from the same fever, the belief that any idea, no matter how unnatural, could be justified if it ended a war. And that belief, more than any bomb, would change the world. By the winter of 1944, the Pacific was a graveyard of ambition. Cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Kobe had already begun to fall under waves of incendiary bombing. The firestorms were beyond comprehension. Men who had once tested bats now stood on the decks of B-29s, watching entire neighborhoods dissolve in heat. Napalm was the new king of weapons, cruel, efficient, unrelenting. In March 1945, over 100,000 people died in one night as fire swept through Tokyo. In the chaos, No one remembered a time when the goal had been to burn without killing. Adams followed the war from home. He clipped newspaper articles, collected photos, and wrote letters to anyone who would listen. Some said he had gone mad. But in his heart he still believed his bats could have done it better. Less blood, less horror. He didn't yet know that the world was about to witness something far worse. In the early morning of August 6, 1945, a silver plane crossed the Pacific sky. Inside, men checked instruments and whispered prayers. The weapon they carried had no wings, no heartbeat, no sound until the end. When the bomb detonated over Hiroshima, it burned hotter than the sun. In a flash, the dream of humane warfare vanished forever. What Adams had once imagined, thousands of small fires, precise and contained, was replaced by a single light that erased a city. When the news reached him, he said nothing for days. To his wife he only murmured, "They chose the wrong fire." But perhaps there was no right one. And so, Project X-ray faded into obscurity. The documents were filed, the prototypes dismantled. The Navy's final report was clinical and cold, effective but impractical. Terminated in favor of superior developments. No mention of the men who built it. No record of the thousands of bats that died in its service. Just a few lines in a war that had produced too many experiments to count. Yet the moral question lingered like smoke that never cleared. When does creativity become cruelty? When does innovation cross the line into insanity? War has a way of bending those lines until they vanish entirely. The bat bomb was proof of that, a weapon conceived not out of hatred but out of logic, efficiency, and a twisted kind of compassion. Burn the houses, not the people. That was the reasoning. But fire does not discriminate. Once released, it obeys no master. Historians would later debate whether Project X-ray could have changed the war. Some argued it was madness, others that it might have saved lives by ending the conflict earlier. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. The test had proven its effectiveness. The logistics were solvable. Had it been deployed, entire cities could have been set ablaze before Japan even understood what was happening. There were plans, maps marked with red circles over Osaka, Yokohama, and the outskirts of Tokyo. Flight paths were drawn, payloads calculated, crews trained. The operation was to be conducted in pre-dawn hours, the bats released into still air, their bombs timed to ignite just as workers arrived at the morning shift. Thousands of fires, simultaneous, invisible. A storm of wings and flame. It would have worked. That is the most chilling part. But history is not built on what works. It's built on what's chosen. And in 1945, the United States chose the atom. In the archives of the Naval History Division, a single photograph remains from Project X-ray. It shows a gloved hand holding a bat, its wings spread, a tiny metal cylinder strapped to its chest. The animal's face is calm, almost serene, as if unaware of its role. Behind it, the blurred figure of a man in uniform stares into the lens. You can't tell if he looks proud or ashamed. It's an image that captures the essence of that time, the collision between innocence and destruction, science and superstition, humanity and its own reflection. It asks a question no bomb can answer. When we turn life into a weapon, what part of us dies with it? The war ended. Peace returned. But the men who built the bat bomb carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Some went on to work in aeronautics, others in medicine, a few in the weapons programs that shaped the Cold War. They would laugh years later about the absurdity of it all. We tried to win the war with bats, one of them said, and they tried to end it with stars. Meaning the atomic test that lit up the desert night. But laughter is a mask. Beneath it was something darker, a realization that in war even the most innocent creatures can be made to serve death. The line between nature and machine, between the living and the expendable, had blurred forever. At WWII, the ruins of the mock Japanese villages still stand, silent and skeletal, their charred timbers preserved by dry desert air. Tourists aren't allowed near them. The official reason is safety. The real reason is memory. It's easier to forget. And yet, every so often, a researcher uncovers another report, another film reel, another faded photograph, and the story breathes again. For a brief moment, the bats of Project X-ray take flight once more, wings whispering across history, carrying not bombs this time but questions. What does it mean to be human in a world that builds weapons out of life itself? What happens when our imagination, that most beautiful of gifts, becomes our curse? The answer may lie in that empty desert, in the silence that followed the fires. But the silence never lasts. Years after the war, the desert forgot their names, but not their echoes. In 1948, a classified memo resurfaced from the Navy's archive. It contained a single line, typed in fading ink. Had Project X-ray been carried through to fruition, the results might have equaled or surpassed the atomic bomb in effectiveness. The paper was unsigned, almost reluctant to exist. But its words carried a quiet tremor, the ghost of a path not taken. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, Lytle Adams was still alive, though the world had moved past him. He had tried to patent his invention, aerial incendiary delivery system utilizing biological flight carriers, but the U.S. government had sealed the technology. He gave interviews, wrote articles, sent letters to congressmen. Most never replied. To them he was a curiosity, an eccentric remnant of wartime hysteria. But in his own mind, Adams remained something else, the man who almost changed history. He once said in an unpublished letter, "If the bat bomb had flown, Hiroshima might still be standing." It's a haunting thought. One born from guilt as much as pride. By the early 1950s, new wars were brewing. The Cold War had replaced the hot one. Science was no longer the servant of peace, it was its fragile shield. Laboratories hummed again with secrecy, but the projects had grown bigger, colder, less human. No more creatures, no more wings. Only circuits, uranium, and the steady hum of machines that could erase entire nations. In that new order, Adams's dream seemed almost naive, a relic of a more imaginative madness. But imagination is dangerous. It doesn't die when a war ends. It waits. Deep inside the Pentagon's archives, historians and intelligence officers began to notice a pattern. Almost every bizarre wartime project, bat bombs, pigeon-guided missiles, sound cannons, weather control, had started from the same seed, fear. Not hatred, not ideology. Fear. The fear of falling behind, of losing the race, of being destroyed. Fear is the most fertile soil for invention. And under enough pressure, even a dentist can become a weapons designer. That realization disturbed them. Because if fear had driven such ingenuity once, it could do so again. In 1959, a former Marine who had worked on the X-ray tests spoke at a veterans gathering. He told the crowd about the mock Japanese village, the bats, the fires, the absurdity of it all. Some laughed. Others just stared. When he finished, a man in the back asked, "Would you have done it, if they told you to drop it for real?" The Marine thought for a long time before answering. "We would have done it," he said quietly. "We didn't think about right or wrong back then. We just wanted to win." That was the unspoken truth of the age. Winning mattered more than living with what it took to win. But not everyone forgot. In 1967, a small file labeled X-ray ED classified was transferred to the National Archives. Inside were black and white photos, bats hanging from wires, test villages engulfed in flame, and a group of men in uniform grinning beside a cage. The images were clinical, detached, yet the horror was unmistakable. One showed a burned bat on the ground, its wings fused into ash, the tiny incendiary casing still attached. The caption read simply, "Test complete." The human eye can grow numb to horror when it's written in reports. But photographs remember everything. The men in those photos are long dead now. Their faces frozen at the moment between pride and regret. They were soldiers, scientists, patriots. They had done what they believed was necessary. But history rarely cares about belief. It only remembers consequence. And the consequence of Project X-ray wasn't measured in battles won or cities burned. It was measured in realization. The realization that even in a just war, the human mind can wander into nightmares of its own making. That the same curiosity that paints the stars can also weaponize the smallest living thing. That imagination, unmoored from morality, can become a predator. There's a strange irony in what came next. In the decades following World War II, bats became symbols of horror in popular culture, creatures of the night, feared and misunderstood. But few people knew that once, those wings were meant to carry human fire. When movies showed bats as monsters, the truth was simpler and darker. It was not the bats that were monstrous. It was us. The legacy of Project X-ray never completely vanished. In the 1970s, during the height of the Cold War, Soviet military researchers stumbled upon declassified fragments of the project and attempted to replicate it. The tests were brief and unsuccessful, but the logic remained. nature as a delivery system for destruction. Decades later, during modern biological warfare studies, echoes of the same concept reappeared, using insects, birds, and animals as vectors. Technology changed. The idea did not. There's something deeply human about that persistence. We cannot resist turning the world into a mirror of our own ambitions. Every living thing becomes a reflection of our will, our tools, our soldiers, our symbols. And in doing so, we forget what they truly are, reminders of a balance we keep breaking. In 1999, a historian named Jack Kuffer, the same biologist who once held the bats in his hands, finally published his memoirs. The book was titled Bat Bomb, World War II's Other Secret Weapon. In it, he wrote, "We didn't see it then, but we were playing God with creatures that had no say in our war. We told ourselves it was clever. Maybe it was. But cleverness is not the same as wisdom." That line would be quoted for years to come, usually by people studying ethics and science. It captured the essence of the 20th century's great contradiction, our capacity to invent always outpacing our capacity to understand. When Kuffer visited the old test site in Utah decades later, he described the moment vividly. "It was quiet," he said. "No smoke, no wind, just silence. But I could still see them, the bats, the fires, the faces. You can't bury something like that. You can only walk among its ghosts." And perhaps that is the true legacy of Project X-ray. Not the weapon, not the science, but the haunting realization that our greatest inventions often reveal our smallest virtues. We call it innovation, but sometimes it's just our imagination escaping its cage. By the dawn of the new millennium, Project X-ray was no longer a secret. Documentaries mentioned it briefly, always as a footnote to the atomic age, a bizarre curiosity, an anecdote to human absurdity. But for those who knew its story, it was never funny. It was a mirror held up to the fever of a world at war, showing that genius and madness are often the same face seen from different sides. And when you look at the photo of that tiny bat with the bomb on its chest, you can almost feel the pulse of something much larger than science, something ancient and human. The desire to control. The fear of losing. The hope that destruction might somehow bring peace. That's what wars are, in the end. Desperate prayers disguised as inventions. By the time the sun sets over the New Mexico desert today, the wind still hums softly across the empty plains of Carlsbad. The hangars are gone, the fences have rusted, and the test fields where thousands of tiny wings once beat against the air are nothing but dust and sagebrush. But if you stand there long enough, in the right silence, you can almost hear it again. The faint whisper of wings, the flicker of fire, the echo of a time when the world believed that even the smallest creature could carry the weight of a nation's war. Project X-ray remains one of the strangest ideas ever to emerge from World War II, but perhaps that's precisely why it matters. It reminds us that war isn't always forged in the minds of villains, it's built in the hearts of believers. Men who truly thought they were saving lives, who convinced themselves that a bat carrying a bomb was mercy in motion. They called it innovation. History calls it something else. The quiet collapse of reason. When you read the declassified files, the language is clinical, stripped of emotion. Subject exhibits proper aerodynamic behavior. Ignition successful. Casualties, none domestic. But between those sterile lines lies a story not of data but of faith, the kind of faith that convinces humanity that it can outsmart nature, outthink morality, and outrun consequence. Every empire believes it's different, that its motives are pure, its experiments necessary. But the desert remembers otherwise. Lytle Adams died in 1970, still convinced that his idea could have changed history. His family buried him with a small bronze plaque, inscribed with the words inventor, visionary, patriot. There is no mention of bats or bombs or fire. Just 3 words polished by time. It's almost poetic, because what he represented was larger than a single project. He was the face of a generation that had seen the world break, and believed that only imagination could fix it. Even if that imagination burned. In the decades since, historians and ethicists have dissected Project X-ray as both comedy and cautionary tale. Some call it absurd, others chilling. But the truth lies in its simplicity. It was the purest expression of war stripped of its grandeur, a species using everything at its disposal, even the natural world, to destroy itself. And perhaps that's what makes the story timeless. It's not just about bats. It's about us. We live in an age where science still races ahead of ethics. Where the same ingenuity that cured diseases also builds weapons that think for themselves. Where algorithms, not admirals, now decide who lives and who dies. The faces have changed, but the questions haven't. What do we sacrifice when innovation becomes obedience? When the pursuit of safety becomes the worship of power? When every idea, no matter how monstrous, is excused by the word necessary? The bat bomb never flew over Japan. But its spirit, the spirit of desperate invention, still flies through every lab, every defense budget, every silent justification. The same flame that once burned in the caves of Carlsbad flickers today in the circuits of drones, in the programs that turn code into combat. Different era. Same fire. It's tempting to laugh at Project X-ray, to see it as an odd footnote, a ridiculous experiment from a more primitive time. But behind the absurdity lies the same equation that governs every conflict. Fear multiplied by intelligence equals destruction. And that formula never expires. Standing in the desert now, you can almost imagine atoms looking up at the horizon, the same horizon that saw the first atomic test glow red in 1945. Two fires born of the same war. One born from wings, one from atoms. Both from men who believed they could save the world if only they burned it the right way. History often remembers the victors, but it rarely remembers the dreamers. The quiet ones who sat in dark rooms, sketching ideas that would never see the light of day. Yet they are the soul of every war, the proof that creativity itself is neither good nor evil. It's just a mirror reflecting the hands that hold it. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Project X-ray, that the cost of progress is not measured in success or failure, but in what we are willing to turn into a weapon. Whether it's a bat, an atom, or an idea, the question remains, how far will we go to win? The screen fades to black. The narrator's voice lowers, almost a whisper now. In the end, the bats never reached Japan. They slept in steel boxes, dreaming of open skies they'd never see again. And when their time came, they burned not for victory but for the illusion of control. The desert kept their secret. Until now. If history teaches us anything, it's that the strangest truths are often the most human. And that sometimes the line between genius and madness isn't drawn in ink or fire, but in wings. So next time you look at the night sky and see something small flicker against the stars, remember, not every weapon of war comes from hate. Some are born from hope, and that might be the most dangerous kind of all. And if you want to keep uncovering the forgotten corners of history, the secret projects, the untold truths, the echoes of human ingenuity at its most haunting, subscribe. Stay with us. Because the past isn't dead. It's only sleeping. Waiting for someone to wake it again.